What history romanticizes as a noble last stand was, in reality, the predictable collapse of a strategically indefensible position held by men who had already lost the war of decision. The defenders' refusal to evacuate or negotiate was less an act of transcendent courage than a fatal entanglement of personal pride, frontier bravado, and misplaced faith in Texian reinforcements that never came. By March 6, 1836, the Alamo was no longer a military asset. It had become a symbolic trap that Santa Anna would exploit with ruthless clarity. After 12 days of continual cannon fire, the garrison, perhaps 180 to 250 men, was physically spent, low on powder and shot, and psychologically frayed. Only 32 additional fighters had slipped through Mexican lines. The rest of the revolutionary cause remained conspicuously absent. This isolation was no accident. Santa Anna had designed the siege to isolate and demoralize, and the defenders' stubborn refusal to accept repeated surrender offers played directly into his hands. Their decision to stay was driven not merely by ideology, but by the psychology of sunk costs. Having proclaimed the mission a point of no retreat, evacuation would have meant admitting strategic failure and personal cowardice in the eyes of their peers. Santa Anna understood the power of spectacle. The blood-red flag hoisted over Bakeshar was not theatrical flourish, it was calculated psychological warfare. By declaring no quarter, he stripped the defenders of any rational incentive to surrender and simultaneously guaranteed that the coming slaughter would reverberate across Texas as an unmistakable message: resistance equals annihilation. This was not blind rage, but cold policy, the deliberate manufacture of atrocity to break the will of an embryonic rebellion before it could consolidate. At midnight, the Mexican assault columns moved forward in near total silence, ladders and breaching tools in hand. The prohibition on smoking, talking, and even unnecessary movement reveals the professionalism of an army that, despite popular caricature, was capable of disciplined night operations. Inside the mission, men slept in snatches amid the stink of gunpowder and unwashed bodies, clinging to the thin conviction that their stand still mattered. Yet the deeper truth is brutal. By choosing symbolic martyrdom over strategic withdrawal, the Alamo's commanders had already determined the outcome. The battle itself would last barely 90 minutes, but its real significance lay in what preceded it, the moment when bravado hardened into self-destruction, and Santa Anna turned that choice into a weapon. One persistent myth claims the defenders fought to the last man in open combat because they were simply too brave to yield. Contemporary accounts, Mexican officers' reports, survivor testimonies from non-combatants inside the walls, and even some Texian letters show instead a chaotic, fragmented defense. Desperate hand-to-hand fighting in courtyards and darkened rooms, men shot or bayoneted while reloading or retreating, and a final collapse into small pockets of resistance that were quickly overwhelmed. The "Last Stand on the Walls" image, burned into popular memory by later paintings and films, is largely artistic invention. The reality was messier, more human, and far less cinematic. Exhausted men dying in confusion rather than glory. What began before dawn on March 6, 1836, was never merely the fall of a mission. It was the deliberate sacrifice of a garrison that had outlived its military usefulness, turned by both sides into the bloody cornerstone of a revolution that would ultimately succeed because of, not in spite of, the terror Santa Anna unleashed there. William Barrett Travis's increasingly desperate letters begging for aid went unanswered, leaving the garrison isolated and resigned to their fate. Their decision to remain was not pure heroism, it was the product of a toxic mix of frontier machismo, overconfidence in eventual Texian reinforcements, and the psychological trap of having publicly staked their honor on holding the mission. By the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, the men inside the walls knew they stood alone, yet they stayed, transforming a tactical error into a self-fulfilling prophecy of annihilation. The Mexican assault unraveled almost immediately. A premature shout from one column shattered the silence, triggering a chain reaction of noise that destroyed the element of surprise. Colonel Duke's frantic attempts to quiet his men failed. Santa Anna, recognizing the moment had slipped, simply ordered the bugles to sound the degüello, no quarter, no prisoners. The attack devolved into a chaotic human wave of fear-driven momentum rather than disciplined precision. Thousands surged forward in the dark, ladders raised, but the plan quickly fragmented under the weight of its own haste. The first two columns crashed against the north wall, met by a withering volley that shredded the Toluca battalion and mortally wounded Duke. Yet the assault pressed on relentlessly, soldiers climbing over their own dead, turning corpses into improvised steps. The third column veered north under fire, funneling thousands into a deadly choke point. Orders dissolved into raw noise, shouts in Spanish and English, the crash of ladders, the thud of rifle butts and axes. Smoke choked the air. Visibility vanished. This was not a coordinated siege, but a violent, improvised storm of desperation on both sides. Inside, Travis seized his shotgun and rushed to the north wall with Joe, his enslaved servant, only to confront the terrifying sight of dark masses of men bearing down. His shouted challenge, "Come on, boys! The Mexicans are upon us, and we'll give them hell!" was answered by hell itself. He fired both barrels into the tide, then fell early, likely shot in the head. His death within minutes of the assault's start underscores the brutal speed of the collapse. The garrison's command structure evaporated almost instantly. One enduring myth holds that the defenders fought in heroic, orderly ranks from the walls until the very end. Eyewitness accounts, Mexican officers' dispatches, the testimonies of survivors like Joe and Susanna Dickinson, and even some Texian letters, paint a far messier picture: fragmented, hand-to-hand fighting in courtyards and rooms, men dying while reloading or retreating, small pockets of resistance overwhelmed in confusion. The cinematic image of a final united stand atop the ramparts is largely a later invention. The reality was grimly human: exhausted men fighting for survival in darkness and smoke with no hope of victory. In those frantic 90 minutes, the Alamo became less a battle than a deliberate bloodletting. Santa Anna's calculated terror weaponized the defenders' own stubbornness, turning their refusal to withdraw into the very spectacle of massacre that would galvanize the Texian cause. As the north wall gave way under the weight of committed reserves, the disciplined granaderos, the Mexican assault shifted from faltering to unstoppable. Santa Anna, observing from a distance and misreading the initial chaos as failure rather than the predictable disorder of a night attack against prepared defenses, poured in his reserves at precisely the moment when the exhausted garrison could no longer hold any coherent line. The north wall crumbled, soldiers flooded the plaza, and the battle dissolved into a series of disconnected, murderous vignettes fought room by room in near darkness. On the southwest, Colonel Morales's column overran the artillery positions, seized the 18-pounder, and turned it against the interior walls, each discharge shattering adobe and burying men alive under collapsing debris. Defenders, out of viable ammunition, fought with clubbed rifles, knives, and bare hands until they were overwhelmed. The compound became a charnel house, doorways jammed with corpses, the air thick with blood, powder smoke, and the screams of the dying. Women and children cowered in the church as cannon fire shook the structure and footsteps thundered overhead. One child was shot in the initial rush before the soldados realized they had entered a space of non-combatants. Attempts at escape were cut down mercilessly. Small groups of Texians tried to break for the Gonzales Road, only to be ridden down by Mexican cavalry under Colonel Cessna. Survivor accounts conflict on numbers, 10, 60, or somewhere between, but none succeeded. Individual moments of pathos, such as a defender clutching his young son atop the wall before both disappeared in the melee, survive only as fragments, their exact fate obscured by time and contradictory testimony. In under 90 minutes, the firing ceased. Santa Anna entered the compound to find General Castrillon presenting a handful of captured defenders, most likely including Davy Crockett, and urging quarter. Santa Anna ordered their immediate execution, consistent with the no-quarter policy he had proclaimed. The fate of key figures remains deliberately murky. Crockett may have died fighting, may have been captured and killed, may have been among those summarily shot. Bowie, bedridden with illness, perished inside, though whether he fired from his cot or was bayoneted without rising is unknowable. One of the most persistent myths is that the Alamo defenders died in a single, glorious, unified last stand, ranks unbroken, Crockett swinging old Betsy to the end, Bowie blazing away from his sickbed in cinematic defiance. Eyewitness testimony, Mexican officers, non-combatant survivors like Joe and the Tejano women, even Santa Anna's own dispatches, reveals instead a fragmented, desperate struggle, men killed while retreating, reloading, hiding, or simply cornered. The unified last stand image was largely constructed later by romantic artists, dime novels, and film. The reality was far more fragmented, more pitiful, and more human. Exhausted individuals dying piecemeal in confusion, and pain rather than as a choreographed tableau of heroism. Afterward, the victors stripped and burned the Texian dead on pyres that blazed for hours, denying them burial as a final act of contempt. Only Gregorio Esparza was spared because of family ties to the Mexican army. Santa Anna interrogated the surviving women and children, gave them token silver and blankets, then released them to spread terror. Susanna Dickinson and Joe carried the news to Gonzales. The garrison annihilated, no prisoners taken, resistance met with annihilation. The Alamo did not fall because its defenders were uniquely brave or because Santa Anna was uniquely cruel. It fell because a small, isolated force, trapped by its own rhetoric and strategic misjudgment, faced an army willing to pay any price for a decisive psychological blow. Their choice to stay turned personal conviction into collective sacrifice. And Santa Anna turned that sacrifice into the most effective recruiting poster the Texas Revolution ever had. The men inside fought not to become immortal legends, but because they believed the cause demanded it. In dying chaotically and completely, they ensured the cause would live.